The envelope lay before me like a silent dare, its weight out of proportion to the paper inside. The late morning light spilled across my oak desk, catching the trembling edge of the seal where my father-in-law's initials gleamed in hard black. Ink. At 58, I've learned the difference between silence born of peace and silence born of restraint. This was the second kind. I could almost hear his voice again, half amused, half certain. A man without family money should never dream. Too high. Back then I smiled and pretended not to understand. It was easier than explaining that I'd long since stopped dreaming. I was quietly building. The irony of that memory hovered as I slit the envelope and scanned the first line. An urgent request. For my presence at headquarters, a matter critical to the company's future. He wants to discuss a merger that could save everything, though he doesn't know who truly owns everything. My pulse steadied. Decades of quiet work had led here to one meeting that could collapse or confirm them all. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old ink. I folded the letter carefully, thinking how fortunes can fail long before men realize they've lost respect. With slow precision, I placed the envelope beside the fountain pen I'd bought back when I signed my very first share agreement, one they never noticed. Somewhere between caution and inevitability, I knew the time for silent building was ending, and the reckoning had begun. When I first met Clara, I mistook her poise for warmth. She belonged to the kind of family that moved through the world as though the ground itself had been tailored for their steps. I was 29, then ambitious, but cautious, fresh from a public university and a modest home where dinners were equal parts laughter and thrift. Her father met me with the polite smile reserved for promising employees, not prospective sons-in-law. I remember his first question wasn't about love or plans. It was, "Do you intend to make a living or a statement?" Clara laughed lightly, not realizing he meant it. I answered that I hoped to make both. Our marriage began within those guarded walls of civility. Clara was kind but steeped in the subtle faith that money ensured correctness. I learned early that disagreement sounded to her like ingratitude. When her father offered me a small role in the firm as a technical consultant on environmental systems, I accepted without hesitation. The position came without title, just an assignment to solve problems no one else found important. It suited me. I liked the quiet, the slow efficiency of systems that rewarded consistency over charm. The factory floors proved more welcoming than the boardroom. The men there taught me the unspoken art of loyalty. A man who listens carefully can command more than one who shouts. Over time, they began calling me Sir Michael, with affection rather than protocol. Suppliers telephoned me directly when raw materials ran short. These small circles of trust, the invisible machinery beneath the company's grandeur, became my true department. My father-in-law dismissed it as clerical curiosity. Let him. I was collecting more than experience. I was building a map of the firm few others understood. Then came the crisis of '97. A sharp market swing left the business trembling under loans it couldn't meet. I watched executives depart in polished cars, claiming personal reasons. Factories slowed. Whispers grew. One evening, buried in the back of the monthly accounts, I saw a loophole, a private opportunity to purchase a block of preferred shares quietly offloaded by a desperate subsidiary. I withdrew my savings, everything I had, and acquired them. No ceremony. No announcement, just paperwork that placed 47% of the parent holdings in a separate entity under my name. It wasn't cunning, it was necessity. I wanted Clara safe, her life unchanged, even if her father's empire fell. When the markets recovered, the company appeared miraculously steady. My father-in-law congratulated himself for his vision. I congratulated. The endurance of humility. I never told Clara. She assumed the renewed prosperity restored her father's dominance, and I let the myth breathe. Her world depended on such illusions the way brittle glass depends on careful handling. And yet, as years passed, a distance crept in, not hostility, but a polite unfamiliarity. We shared dinner conversations about staff promotions and charity galas, while my real life unfolded under balance sheets and late-night phone calls to silent partners. There was satisfaction, yes, but of the quiet kind. I took pride not in ownership, but in order the knowledge that foresight had protected us all, even the man who laughed at me for marrying upward. Still, secrets cast shadows, even benevolent ones. Success without recognition feels like grace withheld. Each time Clara spoke of her father's brilliance, gratitude flickering behind her smile, I nodded and changed the subject. People prefer the stories that make them comfortable. I preferred silence, it never demanded apology. Yet silence, I would learn, has its own cost. For every truth deferred accumulates interest. It began innocently enough, the way storms often do, first a comment, then a pattern too deliberate to ignore. My father-in-law had recently taken a liking to Clara's younger sister's husband, a marketing executive half my age whose greatest skill seemed to be occupying space noisily. He laughed too loudly, shook hands too tightly, and dropped business jargon like confetti at every gathering. The old man adored him. Fresh blood, he called him, as if experience were a disease one ought to shed. I was still the dependable son-in-law. Who knew the operations, a phrase that now sounded like both compliment and confinement. The shift crystallized during an anniversary dinner at their estate. Long tables, crystal glass catching candlelight, the family arrayed like an audience. The new golden boy was holding court, describing an upcoming expansion plan, punctuating his vision with little glances toward my father-in-law, the way a student checks if the teacher approves. Midway through dessert, the old man leaned back and announced, "It takes courage to keep the business in capable hands. Some men know when to step aside." Laughter followed, polite and sharp around the edges. I didn't bother asking who those men were supposed to be. I simply smiled, folded my napkin, and pressed it against my lap to hide that my hands had steadied themselves into calm. Clara avoided my gaze. Her silence stung more than the insult. In old families, loyalty often yields to habit. 2 days later, an envelope arrived through internal mail at the office. It contained a memo outlining an early retirement appreciation package, gracious, efficient, and final. It even included a drafted note of thanks I could personalize before returning it for press circulation. I read it twice, the way one rereads a joke to confirm it's intended to humiliate. I didn't tear it up. Rage is a poor editor. I simply placed it in the drawer with the others, the old investment documents, the signed escrow confirmations, the quiet proofs of ownership no one knew existed. While their laughter still echoed in my memory, my mind drifted back to that day in '97 when I inked my name carefully next to 47%. Numbers, unlike people, do not forget. That evening, Clara mentioned the company's restructuring as if commenting on the weather. "Father says it's time to modernize. We'll finally attract investors who can take it global." She spoke with the lightness of someone safe inside a story written by others. I poured her a glass of wine and let the conversation pass. What would she have done with truth anyway? To her, my practical work was a polite hobby. To me, it was the spine holding their empire upright. In the weeks that followed, whispers thickened. Departments merged and disappeared. The favored son-in-law received a new title, embossed in silver, acting executive director. I became in their eyes a relic useful only as long as I stayed modest. Yet humility, though silent, is never powerless. Each meeting I attended as a token advisor, I took notes with the same patient precision that once saved their fortunes. Foolish men underestimate what's hidden beneath calm. Inside, I wrestled with two loyalties, the one owed to pride and the one owed to peace. Revealing my stake would shock Clara, break her image of her father. Concealing it too long might turn my silence into complicity. Every day I postponed the choice felt like sanding a wound smooth without healing it. Then, on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday, the father-in-law's assistant, a nervous man who normally avoided conversation, appeared at my door. He handed me a large envelope, heavier than paper ought to be. "From Mr. Hawkins," he murmured. I waited until I was alone before opening it. Inside, there was a formal summons, requesting your immediate attendance at headquarters to negotiate remaining rights regarding key holdings prior to merger. Remaining rights. He must have discovered something small, not the root. I felt a flicker of pity. Years of arrogance had blinded him to the simplest truth. that ownership in silence is still ownership. I slipped the letter into my briefcase, closed it carefully, and exhaled. Somewhere beyond irritation lay anticipation. After all, these years of deliberate quiet, the reckoning I had postponed was finally making its own introduction. There were nights when I could almost hear the pulse of the company through the hum of the lamp in my small garage office. The place smelled of metal filings and paper dust, a draft pushing softly through the uneven window frame. While others assumed I had long gone to bed, I sat surrounded by ledgers and quarterly reports, some straightforward, others coded through quiet partnerships I'd built in forgotten corners of the firm. The rhythm of numbers soothed me. Profit. Margins told cleaner truths than the speeches upstairs. Pride makes men talk too much. In silence, data whispered the reality behind those fine boardroom promises. I had begun, years earlier, to cultivate relationships with the overlooked, the subcontractors who kept machines running, the logistics brokers who knew when supply lines trembled, the clerks who noticed patterns before analysts did. Over lunch, counters and late-night calls, I learned more about the heartbeat of Hawkins Industries than its glossy directors ever suspected. Many of these people couldn't afford to speak truth upward, so they spoke sideways to me. I listened, advised, and when necessary, bought small stakes in their ventures under discreet agreements. It wasn't manipulation. It was stewardship. A company, I'd learned, is only as moral as the hands guiding its neglected parts. Each report I studied beneath that flickering lamp brought small revelations, the ways executives inflated billing cycles, how contracts were awarded to firms favored for champagne rather than competence, and how ordinary workers bore the burden. Using the influence my near-majority stake granted me, I quietly diverted funds toward stabilizing threatened departments. The legal architecture was complicated, shell layers meant to appear dormant. But within those layers, every correction left a trace of my signature, invisible except to those who knew where to look. If my father-in-law ever wondered why insolvency never arrived at his door, he chalked it up to luck. Pride dulls curiosity. I never saw myself as a savior, only as a caretaker unwilling to watch talent crushed under ego. Still, the discipline of secrecy grew heavier with time. Silence is an armor but also a burden. It deflects applause as well as accusation. There were moments I longed to tell Clara, to see her face register that I wasn't the quiet dependent she imagined. Yet each time the impulse rose, love intervened. She had built her understanding of the world on her father's certainty. Demolishing that foundation would serve no one. Better to let comfort persist, even if it confined me to invisibility. Loneliness became a companion then, not bitter but constant, like the metronome tick of my old desk clock counting the small hours. I told myself the work mattered more than recognition, that dignity need not be witnessed to be real. Still, I would pause sometimes, listening to the night engines deep in the factory district, thinking how many families lived under roofs my silent corrections had kept secure. It was enough, or so I thought. The night before the summons arrived, I remember finishing an audit and leaning back to look around the garage. Files stood like patient soldiers along the shelves. A faint sheen of dust caught the thin beam of the desk lamp. Everything was in order, my quiet kingdom of numbers and restraint. Then came the shuffle of footsteps outside, the brief blur of headlights through the slit of my window, and a knock at the door. When I opened it, the father-in-law's messenger stood there, hat in hand, his expression a mixture of urgency and awkward respect. "Mr. Hawkins requests your presence at headquarters." "First thing tomorrow," he said. "The merger discussions require immediate clarification." His formality barely concealed nervousness. Somewhere, a misunderstanding or a revelation had surfaced. I thanked him, closed the door, and let my gaze rest again on the files. Their spines glowed faintly in the lamplight, silent witnesses to years of unseen work. The stillness around me felt different now, as if even the air understood that concealment's shelter had served its purpose. The clock ticked once, twice, then paused before continuing, a heartbeat of hesitation breaking into resolve. I switched off the light and stood in the dark for a long moment, listening to the hum fade, knowing the years of patience were over. Downstairs, the car engine waited. The storm I had prepared to weather had finally arranged to meet me. The boardroom smelled of furniture polish and anxiety. The walls were lined with framed newspaper clippings proclaiming triumphs from another era, headlines that felt almost mocking now. At the end of the mahogany table sat Harold Hawkins, once Titan, now visibly diminished yet still trying to command. The silence. His hand shook slightly as he aligned the edge of a financial report, refusing to acknowledge what everyone already knew. The company was bleeding cash. I took my habitual seat halfway down the table, neither peripheral nor central. Comfortably forgettable. Clara sat opposite, invited at her father's request to observe the family's future. I could feel her unease radiating like heat. Around us, the new executives smiled the brittle smiles of men rehearsing optimism. The young son-in-law acting director whispered assurances to Harold that the merger proposal would impress everyone. It did, but not the way he imagined. Once the meeting began, charts flickered across a projector screen, bright diagrams mapping decline. Sales margins down, liquidity exhausted, creditors circling. "We have days, not months," Harold declared, his voice cracking on the word days. When silence settled, he added brusquely to complete the merger. "I need approvals from several legacy shareholders' names buried in the archives from years ago. Irrelevant stakes, but legal necessity?" His tone suggested boredom, as though these unknown investors were obstacles rather than owners. I glanced at the spreadsheet displayed before us. One entry 47% held under a dormant holding company, scrolling briefly before the assistant advanced the slide. No one noticed, no one except me. I folded my hands, steadying my breath while the younger men discussed how to convince those investors to sign away their rights. Convince, a polite word for erase. Harold turned toward me finally. "Michael, your familiarity with our operations might help us prepare the narrative. You know how to make people feel secure even when we're strained?" The compliment carried patronage like perfume intended to flatter, arranged to linger. I nodded once. "Of course," I said. When the presentations ended, he cleared his throat. "Now, under new structure, the merged entity will absorb all minor shares, will offer compensation at nominal value to conclude things neatly." He glanced toward his attorney, who confirmed this was both efficient and legal. I reached for my leather folder. A faint rustle drew several eyes, though no one expected disruption from me. After all, I was merely family part of the furniture. The clasp clicked gently. I drew out 2 envelopes, heavy with paper that carried more weight than anyone yet realized. "Before those signatures are finalized," I said quietly, "it might be prudent to identify those minor shareholders." The room paused. Harold frowned, impatience sharpening the edges of his face. "We've already traced them, Michael. Just old entities, long inactive." I slid the first envelope across the table. "Then this may surprise you." For a moment he didn't move. Then curiosity or perhaps irritation pushed him to open it. As he unfolded the documents, color drained from his face. The embossed seal he himself had signed decades ago smiled up at him like a ghost. "Holder, Lewis Holdings Inc., 47% controlling interest?" His gaze lifted slowly toward me, confusion chasing comprehension. "You?" The word barely formed. I met his stare, calm as the air before rain. I never concealed it, Harold. The filings were public, just unread. The room filled with small sounds, the scrape of a chair leg, a soft intake of breath. Clara's hand rose to her mouth. "Michael," she whispered, equal parts wonder and disbelief. Harold's first reaction was anger dressed as disbelief. "This is absurd. You, an employee claiming ownership of nearly half my company?" "Not yours," I said softly. "Ours. I invested when others abandoned it." I thought saving it mattered more than pride. His jaw tightened. Then, as seconds passed, something faltered behind his glare. Pride cracked, letting exhaustion filter through. The truth was too meticulously documented to contest. The other directors shifted in their seats, some already recalculating loyalties. For several beats, no one spoke. Then Harold exhaled, the sound brittle. "All these years you sat here, letting me treat you like—" He stopped himself. Words, once his weapon, now betrayed him. Why didn't you tell me? Because you wouldn't have heard me then, I answered. You measured worth in volume. I prefer endurance. Clara looked between us, eyes bright with tears she didn't yet understand. You did this? For us? For survival? I said. For everyone whose paychecks kept this building alive. Sometimes silence protects more than it hides. The young executive cleared his throat, uncertain whether to speak. I spared him the effort. I'm not here to shame anyone, I said, turning back to Harold. The company can still stand, but only with integrity. Let's restructure, reduce the merger, settle debts responsibly, and safeguard jobs. In exchange, you retire honorably with credit for founding what we've preserved. Harold stared, eyes glistening as though fighting an emotion foreign to him. Finally he nodded, barely perceptible but real. You're a better man than I was to you. Maybe just a quieter one, I replied. When the formalities resumed, tone transformed. The board that had once humored me now listened closely, scribbling notes, weighing each suggestion. Authority no longer required proclamation. It emanated from control revealed too late to contest. By the meeting's end, agreements were drafted. Reporters would later call it a seamless generational transition, unaware of the storm that had raged behind those old paneled doors. As we stood to leave, Harold reached out, hesitant. I shook his hand. His grip trembled, gratitude twined with regret. Clara lingered beside me, the faintest smile on her lips, not pride exactly, but recognition. Outside, the sun pressed through tinted glass. For the first time in decades, the silence surrounding me felt weightless. Truth, when finally spoken without cruelty, transforms even humiliation into peace. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean horizon that smelled faintly of cedar and second chances. The drive home took place in a silence that seemed sacred rather than strained. Evening folded over the highway, the city lights thinning into a soft amber haze. Clara sat beside me, hands clutched loosely in her lap, her posture suspended between shock and fragile comprehension. I kept both eyes on the road, letting the rhythm of the tires carry us through what words could not yet bridge. At last she spoke, the question trembling out of her. How long have you known? Since before we were married, I said. And longer still. Before your father trusted me even to hold a pen in his meetings. She turned toward me, tears gathering, not from anger, but from the sudden realization of the years she'd seen incompletely. Why didn't you tell me? I smiled faintly. Because I wanted your love to be for the man, not the means. We both grew up believing power gave us worth. I needed to be sure I could exist without brand or inheritance defining me. Her eyes shimmered in the dim light. After a long silence, she reached across the console, her hand small and warm against mine. You did, she whispered. And I think that makes me love you more and ache, because I never asked who you really were. Tears slid quietly down her cheeks. I didn't speak. Some truths need the quiet to settle naturally. By morning, news of the meeting had trickled through. Family networks? The whispering tone suggested scandal but ended in admiration. Michael had saved the company. Harold had retired honorably. There were no headlines, only respectful murmurs in board corridors. Lavish praise was offered privately, and I declined each with the same calm refrain, we all did what we had to do. At the official retirement reception weeks later, Harold addressed the staff one last time. His voice, once iron, now held the grain of humility. Strength, he said, is sometimes mistaken for noise. I've learned recently that silence can build more securely than pride. He credited collaborative stewardship for the company's revival. Only Clara and I knew how literal that phrase was. Afterward, he approached me quietly near the window, where rain streaked the glass. You gave me a gentler defeat than I deserved, he said. Thank you for letting me leave with my name intact. I answered simply, a name is worth keeping only when it ends in respect. The months that followed brought a stillness new to our household. Clara seemed freer, unburdened of illusions she hadn't known she carried. Harold kept to his garden, tending roses with the same careful hands that once signed empires into existence. Driving past the office one evening, the lights glowing steady under new leadership. I thought about the sharp edge of power, how it can carve or destroy depending on whose hand wields it. Mercy, I realized, is not weakness. It's control perfected. Behind us, the years of struggle softened into distance, the horizon wide and waiting. Time had resumed its calm, deliberate course, asterisk.